Hello everyone. So today we are starting with chapter number 3 of Modern History by Bipin Chandra, the structure of government and the economic policies of the British Empire in India from 1757 to 1857. Having acquired the vast empire of India, the East India Company had to devise suitable methods of government to control and administer it. The administrative policy of the company underwent frequent changes during the long period between 1757 and 1857. However, it never lost sight of its main objective, that was to increase the company's profits. To enhance the profitability of its Indian possessions to Britain and to maintain the strengthen the British hold over India, all the other purposes were subordinated to these aims. The administrative machinery of the Government of India was designed and developed to serve these ends. The main emphasis of this respect was placed on the maintenance of law and order so that trade with India and exploitation of its resources could be carried on without disturbance. The structure of government. When the officials of the East India Company acquired control over Bengal in 1765, they had little intention of making any innovations in its administration. They only desired to carry on their profitable trade and to collect taxes for remission to England. From 1765 to 1772, in the period of dual government, Indian officials were allowed to function as before but under the overall control of the British governor and the British officials. The Indian officials had responsibility but no power, while the company's officials had power but no responsibility. Both sets of the officials were venal and corrupt men. In 1772, the company ended the dual government and undertook the administered Bengal directly through its own servants. But the evils inherent in the administration of a country by a purely commercial company soon came to the surface. The East India Company was at this time a commercial body designed to trade with the East. Moreover, its higher authority was situated in England, many thousands of kilometers away from India. Yet, it had come to wield political power over millions of people. This anomalous state of affairs posed many problems for the British government. What was to be the relation of East India Company and its possessions to the government in Britain? How were the company's authorities in Britain to control the great multitude of officials and soldiers stationed in faraway India? How was a single center to control to be provided in India over the far-flung British possessions in Bengal, Madras and Bombay? The first of these problems were the most pressing as well as the most important. It was, moreover, closely interwoven with the party and parliamentary rivalries in Britain, the political ambitions of English statesmen, and the commercial greed of English merchants. The rich resources of Bengal had fallen into the hands of company whose directors immediately raised the dividends to 10% in 1767 and proposed in 1771 to raise the further to 12.5%. The company's English servants took advantage of their positions to make quick fortunes through illegal and unequal trade and forcible collection of bribes and gifts from Indian chiefs and zamindars. Clive returned to England at the age of 34 with a wealth and property yielding £40,000 a year. The company's high dividends and fabulous wealth brought home by its officials excited the jealousy of other sections in the British society. Merchants kept out of East by the monopoly of the company, the growing class of manufacturers, and in general the rising forces of free enterprise in Britain wanted to share the profitable Indian trade and the riches of India which the company and its servants alone were enjoying. They therefore worked hard to destroy the company's trade monopoly, and in order to achieve this, they attacked the company's administration of Bengal. They also made the officials of the company who returned from India their special target. These officials were given the derisive title of Nabobs and were ridiculed in the press on the stage. They were boycotted by the aristocracy and were condemned as exploiters and oppressors of the Indian people. The two main targets were Clive and Warren Hastings. By condemning the Nabobs, the opponents of the company hoped to make the company unpopular and to displace it. Many ministers and other members of the parliament were keen to benefit from the acquisition of Bengal. They sought to win the popular support by forcing the company to pay tribute to the British government so that the Indian revenue could be used to reduce taxation or the public debt of England. In 1767, the Parliament passed an act obliging the company to pay the British treasury of 400,000 pounds per year. Many political thinkers and statesmen of Britain wanted to control the activities of the company and its officials because they were afraid that the powerful company and its rich officials would completely debauch the English nation and its politics. The parliamentary politics of Britain during the later half of 18th century were corrupt and in the extreme. The company, as well as its retired officials, bought seats in the House of Commons for their agents. Many English statesmen were worried that the company and its officials, backed by Indian plunder, might gain preponderant influence in the government of Britain. The company and its vast empire in India had to be controlled, or the company, as master of India, would soon come to control British administration and be in a position to destroy the liberties of the British people. The exclusive privileges of the company were also attacked by the rising school of economics presenting free trade, manufacturing, capitalism. In his celebrated work, The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith, the founder of classical economics, condemned the exclusive companies. Such exclusive companies, therefore, are nuisances in many respects, always more or less inconvenient to the countries in which they are established, and destructive to those which have their misfortune to fall under their government. Thus, reorganization of the relations between the British state and the company's authorities became necessary, and the occasion arose when the company had to ask the government for a loan of £1 million. But the company's enemies were many and powerful. It had not without powerful friends in the parliament. Moreover, the King George III was its patron. The company therefore fought back. In the end, the parliament worked out a compromise by which the interests of the company and the various influential sections of the British society were delicately balanced. It was decided that the British government would control the basic policies of the company's Indian administration so that the British rule in India was carried on the interests of the British upper classes as a whole. At the same time, the company would retain its monopoly on the eastern trade and the valuable right of appointing the officials in India. The details of Indian administration were also left to the directors of the company. The first important parliamentary act regarding the company's affairs was the Regulating Act of 1773. This act made changes in the constitution of the Court of Directors of the company and subjected their actions to the supervision of the British government. The Regulating Act soon broke down in practice. It had not given the British government effective to declare control over the company. The act also failed to resolve the conflict between company and its opponents in England, who were daily growing stronger and more vocal. Moreover, the company remained extremely vulnerable to these attacks of its enemies as the administration of its Indian possessions continued to be corrupt, oppressive, and economically disastrous. The defects of the Regulating Act and the exigencies of the British politics necessitated that the passing in 1784 of another important act known as the Pitt's India Act. This act gave the British government supreme control over the company's affairs and its administration in India. It established 6 commissioners for the affairs of India, popularly known as the Board of Control, including 2 cabinet ministers. The Board of Control was to guide and control the work of the Court of Directors and the Government of India. The Act placed the Government of India in the hands of the Governor General and the Council of 3, so that the Governor General could get the support or even one member. He could have his way. The Act clearly subordinated Bombay and Madras presidencies to Bengal in all questions of war, diplomacy, and revenues. With this act began a new phase of British conquest of India. While the East India Company became the instrument of British national policy, India was made to serve the interest of all sections of the ruling classes of Britain. The company, having saved its monopoly of the Indian and Chinese trade, was satisfied. Its director retained the profitable right of appointing and dismissing the British officials in India. Moreover, the government of India was carried out through their agency. While the Pitt's India Act laid down the general framework in which the government of India was to be carried on till 1857, later enactment brought out several important changes which gradually diminished the powers and privileges of the company. In 1786, the Governor General was given the authority to overrule his council in matters of importance affecting safety, peace, or the interest of the empire in India. By the Charter Act of 1813, the trade monopoly of the company in India was ended and trade with India was thrown open to all British subjects. But trade in tea and trade with China were still exclusive to the company. The government of revenue in India continued to be the hands of the company. The company also continued to appoint its officials in India. The Charter Act of 1813 brought the company's monopoly of tea trade and trade with China to an end. The Charter Act of 1833 brought the company's monopoly of tea trade and trade with China to an end. At the same time, the debts of the company were taken over by the government of India, which was also to pay its shareholders 10.5% dividend on their capital. The government of India continued to be run by the company under the strict control of the Board of Control. Thus, various acts of parliament discussed above completely subordinated the company and its Indian administration to the British government. At the same time, it was recognized that the day-to-day administration of India could not run or even so pretend it from a distance of 6,000 miles. Supreme authority in India was therefore delegated to Governor General in Council. The Governor General, having the authority to overrule his council on important questions, became in fact the real effective ruler of India, functioning under superintendence, control, and direction of the British government. The British created new system of administration in India to serve their purpose. But before we discuss the silent features of the system, it would be better if we first examine the purpose with which it was designed to serve. For the main function of the administration system of a country is to accomplish the aims and objects of its ruler. The chief aim of the British was to enable them to exploit India economically and to gain and to the maximum advantage of various British interests, ranging from company in Lancashire manufacturers to Lancashire manufacturers. In 1793, Lord Cornwallis, the Governor General, defined two primary objectives for the Bengal government. It must ensure its political safety and it must render the possession of the country as advantageous as possible to the East India Company and the British nation. At the same time, India was to be made to bear the full cost of its own conquest as well as the foreign rule. The examination of the economic policy of the British in India, therefore, is of prime importance. The British economic policies in India from 1757 to 1857. The first one is the commercial policy. From 1600 to 1757, the East India Company's role in India was that of a trading corporation which brought goods or precious metals into India and exchanged them for Indian goods like textiles and spices, which it sold abroad. Its profits came primarily from the sale of Indian goods abroad. Naturally, it tried constantly to open new market for Indian goods in Britain and other countries. Thereby, it increased the export of Indian manufacturers and thus encouraged their production. This is the reason why Indian rulers tolerated or even encouraged the establishment of the company's factories in India. But from the very beginning, the British manufacturers were jealous of the popularity that Indian textiles enjoyed in Britain. All of a sudden, dress fashions had changed and light cotton textiles began to replace the coarse woolens of the English. Before the author of the famous novel Robinson Crusoe complained that the Indian cloth had crept into our houses and closets and bed chambers, curtains, cushions, chairs, and at last beds themselves were nothing but calicos or Indian stuffs or India stuffs. The British manufacturers put pressure on the government to restrict and prohibit the sale of Indian goods in England. By 1720, laws had been passed forbidding the wear or use of printed or dyed cotton cloth. In 1760, a lady had to pay a fine of £200 for possessing an imported handkerchief. Moreover, heavy duties were imposed on the import of plain cloth. Other European countries except Holland for also either prohibited the import of Indian cloth or imposed heavy import on duties. In spite of these laws, however, Indian silk and cotton textiles still had their own foreign markets until the middle of the 18th century, when the English textiles industry began to develop on the basis of new and advanced technology. After the Battle of Plassey in 1757, the pattern of companies' commercial relations in India underwent a qualitative change. Now the company could use its political control over Bengal to acquire monopolistic control over Indian trade and production, and to push its Indian trade. Moreover, it utilized the revenues of Bengal to finance its export of Indian goods. The activity of the company should have encouraged Indian manufacturers, for Indian exports to Britain went from 1.5 million pounds in 1750-1751 to 5.8 million pounds in 1797 and 1798. But this was not so. The company used its political power to dictate terms to the weavers of Bengal, who were forced to sell their products at cheaper and dictated price, even at a loss. Moreover, their labor was no longer free. Many of them were compelled to work for the company for low wages and were forbidden to work for Indian merchants. The company eliminated its rival traders, both Indian and foreign, and prevented them from offering higher wages or prices to the Bengal handicraftsmen. The servants of the company monopolized the sale of raw cotton and made the Bengal weaver pay exorbitant prices for it. Thus, the weaver lost both ways, as buyer and seller. At the same time, Indian textiles had to pay heavy duties on entering England. British government was determined to protect their rising machine industry, whose products could still not compete with the cheaper and better Indian goods. Even so, Indian products held some of their ground. The real blow to Indian handicrafts fell after 1813, when they lost not only their foreign markets, but what was much of greater importance, their market in India itself. The Industrial Revolution in Britain completely transformed Britain's economy and economic relations with India. During the second half of 18th century, the first few decades of the 19th century, British underwent profound social and economic transformation, and British industry developed and expanded rapidly on the basis of modern machines and the factory system and capitalism. This development was aided by several factors. British overseas trade had been expanding rapidly in the previous centuries. Britain had come to capture and monopolize many foreign markets by means of war and colonialism. These export markets enabled its export industries to expand production rapidly and utilizing the latest techniques in the production and organization. Africa, the West Indies, Latin America, Canada, Australia, China, and above all India provided unlimited opportunities for export. This was particularly true for the cotton textile industry, which served as main vehicle of the industrial revolution in Britain. Britain had already evolved the colonial pattern of trade which helped the industrial revolution, which in turn strengthened this pattern. The colonies and the underdeveloped countries exported agricultural and mineral raw materials to Britain, while the latter sold them its manufacturers. Secondly, there was sufficient capital accumulated in the country for investment into new machinery and factory system. Moreover, the capital was concentrated on the hands of the feudal class, which would waste it in luxurious living, but in the hands of merchants and industrialists who were keen to invest in trade and industry. Here again, the immense wealth drawn from Africa, Asia, the West Indies, and Latin America, including that drawn from India and by the East India Company and its servant after the Battle of Plassey, played an important role in financing the industrial expansion. Thirdly, rapid increase in population met the need of growing industries for more cheaper labor. The population of Britain increased rapidly after 1740. It doubled in 50 years after 1780. Fourthly, the British had government which was under the influence of commercial and manufacturing interest, and which therefore fought other countries determinedly for markets and colonies. Fifthly, the demands for increased production were met by developments in technology. Britain's rising industry could base itself over the inventions of the Hargreaves, Watt, Crompton, Cartwright, and many others. Many of these inventions now utilized had been available for centuries. In order to take full advantage of these inventions, and steam power production was now increasingly concentrated in factories. It should be noted that the product produced that noted that it was not these inventions which produced the industrial revolution, rather it was the desire for manufacturers to increase production rapidly for the expanding markets and their capacity to invest in the needed capital which led them to utilize the existing technology and to call forth the new inventions. In fact, the new organization of industry was to make technical change permanent feature of human development. The industrial revolution has hence in this sense never come to an end. The modern industry and technology have gone developing from one stage to another since the middle of the 18th century. The Industrial Revolution transformed the British society in a fundamental manner. It led to rapid economic development, which is the foundation of today's high standard of living in Britain as well as in Europe, the Soviet Union, and the USA, Canada, Australia, and Japan. In fact, until the beginning of 19th century, the difference in the standards of living of what was today economically advanced and the backward countries was not marked. In the absence of the industrial revolution or the latter group of countries which had led to the immense income gap that we see in the world as of today. Britain became increasingly urbanized as a result of industrial revolution. More and more people began to live in factory towns. In 1750, Britain had only two cities with more than 50,000 inhabitants. In 1851, their number was 29. The two entirely new classes of society were born: the industrial capitalist, who owned the factories, and the workers who hired out their labor on daily wages. While the former class developed rapidly, enjoying unprecedented prosperity, the workers, the laboring poor, in the beginning reaped a harvest of sorrow. They were uprooted from their rural surroundings, and their traditional way of life was disrupted and destroyed. They had to now live in cities which were full of smoke and filth. Housing was utterly inadequate and insanitary. Most of them lived in dark, sunless slums which have been described so well in the novel of Charles Dickens. Hours of work in the factories and mines were intolerably long, often going up to 14 or 16 hours a day. Wages were very low. Women and children had to work equally hard. Sometimes 4 or 5-year-old children were employed in factories and mines. In general, a worker's life was one of poverty, hard work, disease, and malnutrition. It was only after the middle of the 19th century that the improvement in their incomes began to take place.